All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the fourth webinar in our series. This is entitled Schools Are Closed, Now What? We'll be considering school closures in both the P through 12 and higher education context. Like I said, this is the fourth in our series of webinars, which is extending all the way out until late May. We'll be offering webinars on a once or twice weekly basis for basically the next month. We've got 4 down and many to go. And our aim through these webinars is to provide you with the information that you need to help deal with the challenges and decisions that you're facing in both education and the budget. I'm Austin Reed. I'm the Director of Education of the Education Committee here at NCSL, and it's our pleasure to host you again today. Today we're joined by Michelle Ekstrom, who will be presenting on the P through 12 portion of this webinar. She's the Education Director for our program here. And we're also joined by Sunny Day, who is the Program Director of Education for mostly covering higher education, and she'll be here to talk about higher ed as well. They'll be providing you with a brief presentation followed by a period for questions. So there'll be time for questions for both presentations as well as an opportunity for a larger group discussion at the end. Before we get started, I do want to talk about a couple of areas of webinar etiquette that I'd appreciate that everyone could follow. First, if you haven't done so already, please mute your microphone unless you're speaking. We'll have time for questions, but when we're not in that time for questions, please stay muted so that the audio is clean and clear for everybody else. If you have any questions, you could virtually raise your hand, which will allow me to recognize you. But I think the most efficient way for us to facilitate discussion is for you to type your questions into the chat box on the right of your screen. You can either send those questions to our public chat, or you may privately send them questions to me in case you don't want your name put out there, and I will use discretion in asking your question to our hosts here. And then finally, please, under no circumstances should you share your screen. We do, however, appreciate that you turn your camera on so we can see your face and try to create a meeting that as much as possible feels like we're in person together. I think this creates a better context for conversation and makes everyone feel more welcomed here. And finally, this meeting will be recorded, and the archives and the slides are going to be publicly available on NCSL's website where the current recordings have already been placed. All right, with that, we can go ahead and get started, and I will turn it over to Michelle Ekstrom, who will be handling the first portion of the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We wanted the opportunity to update you on what we're seeing across the states, what we're hearing from policymakers really just across the US on the things that are happening and what is coming up pretty immediately for you all to be thinking about and what is coming up long term. And we wanted to really cover the gamut from early ed all the way through K-12. So Sunny and I are going to be presenting on this today, and we certainly welcome all your questions and would encourage you to provide some feedback and maybe share what's going on in your state when we have an opportunity to do that. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in early education. And as you know, most opportunities for early education are also considered childcare. So a lot of the conversation that affects early education is being couched as childcare right now. Before we even got into this situation with COVID, we know that there was a real struggle with providers for early education. Many of them were making poverty level wages. There was limited access to benefits for those providers and those teachers. And they rely really heavily on tuition and parent fees. And so the revenue source for early education, especially by the private providers, was pretty limited. The struggle for families was that there's a real short supply, especially in certain areas of a state or a city, for high quality childcare. And we also know that the costs are very high to families, which presents a real struggle, especially for those families with limited access to financial resources, and there's very limited assistance that's available to those families as well. We also know that providers during this time have been struggling to know how it is that they should think about moving forward. In some states, they've been mandated or highly encouraged to stay open. so that there is access for childcare for those who are considered mandatory workers. And in some states, they've been required to close. So there are definitely mixed messages. There's certainly a risk of permanent closure for some of these providers, as they don't have, many are small businesses and don't have financially sustainable plans to move forward in this situation. And we know that they have a real lack of access to essential supplies to keep their facilities clean and to ensure that it's a safe environment for children. And for families, there's right now a real struggle to pay for childcare, as you can imagine, and also the access to care for those workers who are considered essential. This slide that I have up here really shows you the state of the states when it comes to this. So as I said, there's a real difference across the states between whether or not states have encouraged or closed child care facilities, or encouraged or mandated that they stay open, or whether or not that's just in terms of assistance for essential workers. So how are states responding to this? Many states are trying to do everything they can to address these needs right now. We know that in Rhode Island and Wisconsin, they're working to connect essential workers to providers. And I would say Colorado has a very robust effort, especially in the Denver metro area here as well. There are changes to child care regulations and licensing in Ohio, Kentucky, and New Mexico. There's been work to provide financial assistance for childcare or early learning in Colorado and Texas. And in some states like Michigan and New Jersey, they're including childcare providers in their definition of essential workers. You'll see that where I have those states underlined, those are actually links that you could click on as you go through this presentation if you're looking for that information. Some states are providing direct financial support, continuing payments despite closures, grants or short-term assistance or bonuses in Indiana, North Carolina, and Arkansas, paid sick time, employment, or temporarily disability insurance in Colorado and Rhode Island. Other states are providing guidance on health and safety best practices, and there's also a real effort to try to get access to essential supplies, especially those cleaning supplies and personal equipment for those providers. So let's shift now to the state of things in K-12 education. I have included here a map from Education Week, and as you will see, states are taking vastly different approaches. Even a couple of weeks ago, it was being reported that nearly all states had mandated the closure of all schools, at least for a period of time. And now I think as analysts have gone back in and really looked at either the mandate or the advice that has been given by leaders, you will see it's not actually as clear as yes or no, all schools are closed. Or being mandated to be closed. So you will see some are closed through April, some are closed through May, some are closed for the entire academic year, some are closed until further notice, and in some cases they have just simply highly recommended that schools be closed. So I would encourage you, if you're curious about this, to use that link and to continually to check back. I know as states are thinking about reopening things, this chart may look a little bit different in 2 or 3 weeks. We know that states have waived attendance requirements and are not collecting that required data right now for their accountability systems. They also have moved almost entirely to virtual classrooms or distance education. Although I heard of a school district, a very prominent school district in a state in a large urban area, I heard this morning that they has of yet to implement anything. So we know that it's really varied across the states, and we know that you know, the approach to this is really different from school district to school district. State and district tests have been canceled, and school meals are being distributed. I know that rural areas are struggling with this in a pretty significant way. And so again, this varies quite a bit from school district to school district. So what are the immediate concerns that we're seeing for K-12? These are the concerns that I would say we've been dealing with for the past couple of weeks and probably will be dealing with for the next couple of weeks. Communication flowing from the state, from the local school districts, and to parents and students. What does that look like? How are we making sure that parents and students have a really clear understanding of the state of things right now? How long are schools going to be closed? For how long? Will the students be graded? You know, all of those questions that are coming up. It's really important that the communication plan be put into place and that it be updated regularly. There was a lot of immediate concern, as I was mentioning, about the distribution of school meals. And so states and districts have been working together to figure out how to get those meals. But it's not that straightforward. We heard from a legislator in New York City that talked about the costs that the school districts were incurring trying to get those school meals out to students. And also in some rural areas, there's been concerns about having enough staff to do it and whether or not the staff feels safe distributing those meals. We also know that, as I said, school districts are kind of all over the board on implementation of distance learning, but for the most part, the majority of school districts are putting into place some sort of distance learning effort. However, a big concern is that teachers weren't trained for this particular environment. And so they're having to really learn on the fly, take advantage of whatever platforms were already in place for technology and delivering instruction to students, and build upon that and learn some new tools like Zoom or other creative ways that teachers have been using and finding to reach students at this time, and to find curriculum that's appropriate for the students and will help them move forward in the right direction. Students with disabilities and English learners are challenged right now to be able to operate in this situation, and school districts and teachers report that they too are being challenged to understand how they're supposed to reach those students. And so we actually will have a discussion about this next week, about what kind of efforts we're seeing, how this is playing out, and what concerns should state policymakers have. Access to technology is probably one of the biggest immediate concerns that came out of all of this. We know that there are places where children don't have access to devices. Schools didn't have one-to-one technology for all of the students, and so there wasn't the ability to send those home, or you know, in many cases the families didn't have any technology or extra technology for those students to be accessing. And then of course there's the whole discussion around Wi-Fi and broadband access that has been of concern for a long time, but certainly was exacerbated as we had to move very quickly to this virtual platform. Grading and the evaluation of learning is something that every school district and school is having to figure out. There are no easy answers here. The majority of schools and districts are moving to a hold harmless approach, where students' grades can't go down, they can only go up during this time. As you can imagine, that's not a lot of incentive for students. That takes a lot of self-motivation for them to get online and do the work if they know that they're not actually being graded for it, and there wouldn't be any repercussion if they didn't do it. And along with that, we're seeing a lot of truancy. A lot of kids have just simply not connected with their teachers online, and have sort of disappeared off the grid right now. School districts, as I said, have halted testing, and with that comes the SAT, ACT, and PSAT. And so College Board and ACT are making, are working to put together a plan to ensure that students are still able to move forward with those critical exams for college and career readiness. And then of course is the conversation around graduation. How will we honor those seniors who have been working so hard for 4 years, are excited to move on to college or career, And so school districts are trying to put together plans for what that looks like and determine if a school district, for example, doesn't have or isn't giving letter grades during this period, what does that look like for those graduating seniors? So what do we need to be thinking about long-term in terms of K-12 schools? Top of mind, I would say, for all of the experts as well as policymakers and teachers and others within schools and parents is academic and social emotional loss. The estimates of academic learning loss are pretty significant. We always know that there is a certain amount of summer learning loss, and so we know that that will only be greater in this particular situation, especially for those students who already struggled, who already were falling behind, who are already part of the achievement gap that we so often think about. And so we know that that gap probably will only continue to grow. And this will be something that we'll really seriously have to think about in the next year or two, especially if schools don't resume the way that they normally would in the fall. I know from talking with folks at the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, and the State Boards of Ed organization that states right now and districts right now are beginning to put a plan in place for what school will look like in the fall if we cannot resume the way we normally would. And so we know that this only increases the risk and concern about academic and social emotional learning loss and will only exacerbate the opportunity and achievement gap. And along with that comes equity issues. There's a real concern that those students who are most impacted and maybe most vulnerable to the cuts that we know are coming down the line will be most gravely impacted. And so we're going to have a lot of concerns about equity and whether or not our schools are being able to offer an equitable opportunity for high quality education. Readiness for college and career is certainly going to be impacted. There are many students participating in hands-on learning opportunities, career and technical education, apprenticeships, those sorts of things have had to come to a halt. And so there's a real concern about the states that have moved forward and required those sorts of opportunities for students. How will they be able to maintain those efforts and really ensure that students are ready for college and career, especially our juniors who and sophomores who will be coming up to that point pretty quickly and will have experienced this academic and learning loss. And of top of mind is students' mental health. We already know that we have a mental health crisis in high school. We know that this is a big piece of our concerns around school safety. And so there were a lot of efforts that were in place, a lot of counseling, a lot of work being done at schools to identify those students and get them the assistance they need. And when students aren't in school, it's not as easy to be in touch with those students, and it's certainly not as easy to identify them before they ask for help. And then, of course, school budgets. We know that budgets are going to be dramatically impacted. We had a conversation about this on Tuesday at our previous meeting earlier this week. I would highly encourage you to view that meeting. We know that state and local revenue shortfalls will be significant, particularly because of sales tax, and property tax will take a hit as well, and personal income tax. So all of those different revenue sources that we have at both the state and local levels are going to be dramatically impacted. So what does this mean for our schools, and how are we going to determine how best to make those really painful cuts? We also know that school personnel is being dramatically impacted. We had teachers in the pipeline at teacher preparation programs that weren't able to finish their coursework or their student teaching. And so states are having to figure out very quickly what to do with those potential candidates for teaching. How do we rethink licensure right now in those licensure exams? And how are we going to make sure that the teachers already in the system have what they need to be most effective with our students at a time when they're teaching in a way that they haven't been well trained? And long-term down the road, I think there's going to be a lot of conversations within states about our accountability system. Testing was a big part of that. We won't have that, although we know there's still ways to measure growth, and states will be measuring that despite the lack of information they'll have this spring. But how are we going to think about the things that we measure going forward? What does it mean to have a highly effective school? And how will this bump in the road impact long-term the way that we think about accountability and collecting longitudinal data? We are keeping a very close eye on legislative responses to this. We want to know what you all are thinking about, what your role is in this conversation. Right now, we've tracked about 57 P through 12 bills that are related to COVID-19 through this bill tracker. That picture that's on the screen is a screenshot of what our bill tracker looks like, and the link to our bill tracker is right there on the slides as well. I will say that Ohio, because they were and are still in session, probably has put together the most comprehensive bill that we've seen so far that addressed things like attendance and testing and some of these decisions that had to be made pretty early on. And New York and New Jersey have been working on this too. They have more bills, so they're addressing this through individual bills, and they've addressed things like distance learning also. We know that most states are either recessed or adjourned and will be coming back to finish up budget work or to be dealing with budget cuts that they're going to have to make, and to dive into some of these challenges that you're seeing. And so we expect we're going to see a big uptick in legislation as we be able to meet and convene again. And so we will be tracking all of that very closely for you. So at this time, I'm going to end it here and turn it back over to Austin to facilitate some Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And we are now in the question and answer time. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. We can also have you raise your hand, and I can call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask your question over the audio. Whichever way you get your questions in would be great. I'll give just a second, and look, we've already got a question in. So this is from Jay Kahn. He wants to know what assessment tools can be used to assess achievement gaps, and how will this affect IEPs, tutorial costs, and early learning activities?
So we have a lot of assessment tools. The tests that we already use do show our achievement gaps that we have. We know from both and even national assessments, the NAEP data, that we were already looking at a very significant achievement gap that is persistent no matter which state you look at. Even in Massachusetts, which is arguably the highest performing education system in the country, they still have a very persistent achievement gap that they're trying to deal with. And those typically, the students who typically are challenged by that are those students of color or those students from low income. And we know many times that has a lot to do with the fact that they don't have access to high quality education like students who live in the suburbs or in wealthier school districts do. Unfortunately, we know from research that those students tend to have the newer teachers, the less experienced teachers, the lower performing teachers. And so those assessments are really critical. And the more that we assess, the more often we assess, the more we know about those achievement gaps. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of concern within those communities and by policymakers and experts right now who keep their eye on that issue about the fact that we're not testing right now. So you have, as I said, slipped off the grid, whether that be because they don't have help at home, they don't have access to technology, they're not self-motivated, perhaps they moved, you know, we really don't know where they are or what they're doing or what their circumstances are. Maybe everyone in their household is sick right now with COVID, we don't know. So we know that in the case of those students who were already struggling, who already weren't achieving, if we don't have information and formative, summative assessments and interim assessments, we're not going to have the data that will really demonstrate who is struggling the most. So we have good assessments in place. The data is there for all states, school districts, and teachers to be looking at about who's struggling and who's not, and why that could be. And we just want to make sure that policymakers are keeping that in mind as they're thinking through how we go forward, and the emphasis that we might be putting on getting those assessments back up and running as quickly as possible.
Our next question is, do you have a sense of which states have already made budget cuts or are proposing budget cuts to education?
You know, that I can answer that question, and I'm not sure if Dan Thatcher's online. He might want to jump in here too. From the information that we have, both from our fiscal affairs staff and just from the conversation on the virtual meeting on Tuesday, it seemed as if states are still really trying to figure this out. Some states know how much revenue loss they already have at this point. Some are still assessing. And so it's not my sense that we're at the point yet where states have just gone out and started slashing. I do know there were some states, for example, Idaho, that already had made a budget cut pre-COVID. Already needing to make a change and already anticipating what was coming up, and they adjourned before COVID hit. And so they already had cut 1% across the board anyway. And so some states before they adjourned may have started to anticipate that, but I don't think any have made huge budget cuts or decisions quite yet.
And I can comment a little bit on that.
Thanks, Dan.
Michelle, and that is that a lot of the revenue estimates are still coming in. So many legislatures aren't in a place to act on the budget cuts yet. Where they are, it's typically a withdraw from a rainy day fund or a transfer of funds from one fund into a rainy day fund or an education stabilization fund. And Idaho did something like that, just like that too. And part of it too is the complication with when the personal income tax filing deadline, it was 2 days ago, but now it's going to be in the middle of the summer. So we still aren't quite clear on what those revenues will look like from personal income taxes. So it kind of complicates the forecasting picture and the ability for legislatures to really act on actual revenues coming in. So it's, we do know, I think 12 plus states have made withdrawals from their rainy day funds already. Some have addressed the cuts already as the sales tax revenues have declined, but it's still a moving target, and we're still waiting for more information to come in on income tax, on a variety of tax collections. So that we'll have a better answer to that question 2 weeks from now, probably, on May 1st. We'll get some better data, and then the week after that, we'll probably have a lot better information on what states are making cuts proactively.
And I will just add that we are planning for the virtual meeting on May 1st to bring in our fiscal affairs staff who, along with our school finance experts at the federal and state level, who can talk to what's going on, what they're seeing, what they're hearing about both budget actions and also revenue forecasts.
Thanks. And our last two questions that have come in are related to federal policy. So I will go ahead and just answer briefly those questions. One question was when will the available funds for the elementary and secondary education relief fund through the stimulus be made available? And my understanding is that they should be available sometime next week. That's what the department has indicated, but we'll stay tuned. And of course, when that is available, we will be sure to let you know what that looks like. I also have another question about whether there are opportunities in federal funding for technology infrastructure as distance learning is looking to become the new normal in education. And there's a number of areas in the stimulus package that relate to providing technology for students. Any of the funds in the K-12 relief fund that's due next week can be used to purchase technology. There's also some additional flexibilities for local education agencies to use Title IV funding under the Elementary and Secondary Elementary and Secondary Act to provide purchasing technology. Additionally, the governor's relief funds can also be used to purchase technology. The department in their letter urged governors to do that, although there's no requirement that they follow through on that. So those are just some of the ways that funds from the federal stimulus can be used for technology. So we'll have time for more questions and discussion later, but I want to go ahead and move on to our next section where we talk about closures in higher education. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sunny Day.
Thank you, Austin, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Sunny Day. I work with NCSL's post-secondary education team out of our Denver office, where we closely track and monitor higher education legislation, research, and trends in the states. I again want to encourage questions and discussion. Thanks for what you've shared and asked so far, because those of you who are joining us have really important insight into what's happening in your states and are great resources to us and to each other. So again, please feel free to keep typing your questions into the chat box. So I want to just start with a quick recap of the current state of higher education. More than 1,100 colleges and universities have closed campus. Most have shifted to online-only coursework. Students experienced abrupt closures of dorms and dining halls. And institutions have had to slow or reinvent recruitment and admissions processes. School tours have come to a halt, and admission decision deadlines are being extended. Some new information from the American Council on Education, they're estimating 15% reduction in enrollment for the fall and a 25% reduction in international students. And we're learning already, just as of today, that FAFSA completion rates are down nearly 2% from last year. So certainly all of this leaves students and institutions with great uncertainty about fall enrollment. Yep, great. So I'm gonna start by acknowledging the changing world of higher education. It's important to understand the demographics of today's higher education students. They're not who we might typically picture, an 18 to 22-year-old who's moving into the dorms at a four-year institution. And they're not necessarily seeking a four-year baccalaureate degree. So nearly half of undergraduate students attend community colleges, and almost 40% of today's higher education students are working adults. So these students face additional challenges as they progress through their higher education pursuits, including issues like transportation and childcare, food and/or hunger, housing, and above all, affordability. So here's where I really want to emphasize that, of course, we all know affordability is not just about college access, it's also about college completion. So how the pandemic will impact students' ability not to just get to college, but to get through college. How will this forced move to online learning, the lack of on-campus supports, and emerging economic challenges impact college access and completion? I also wanted to briefly address the impact of the forced move to full-time online learning on students. You know, institutions weren't, we're still in the previous slide, is that right? No, this is it. Yeah. Okay, small. Institutions weren't really prepared for fully online learning and are finding now that there's a difference between online learning in an emergency situation versus what is true in intentional online or distance learning. This wasn't well planned, thought out online learning. It's forced online learning with mere weeks to prepare. And so there are concerns that this will certainly exacerbate critical issues. For students, we know that lots of students already struggle with access issues. Lots of students in the system are working adults with families who will struggle to complete this semester, let alone return next semester to continue their education. We know already that low-income first-generation students in particular benefit from deeper engagement with guidance counselors or mentor networks, and those are likely struggling right now as well. It's not a small number of students who don't have homes to go home to. And if you think about the number of students who might struggle with having a laptop, reliable high-speed internet, and a safe and productive place to work all day, you see that it really is a number of challenges for today's students. There are also some potential pitfalls for students in terms of how this semester plays out and does or does not move them closer to completion. So a big concern is the move by institutions to offer or require a pass-fail grade for courses students are taking this semester. In general, it's significantly harder to transfer a pass-fail class to majors and to other institutions than it is to transfer a letter grade. And in many cases, it just doesn't transfer. So will certainly create challenges for students who want or need to transfer schools, which is a number that's already much larger than is widely understood and certainly likely to get bigger in the wake of the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, nearly 4 in 10 college and university students transferred at least once. And certainly those proportions are expected to rise. When transferring schools, students lose on average more than 40% of the credits they've already earned and paid for. So that requires them to retake courses. It certainly increases the amount of time and money spent to get their degree. And even some of the credits that are accepted don't always apply to students' majors. So, you know, all of these moving pieces could lead students to lose momentum and potentially drop out or stop out. And should full-time enrollment continue into the fall, the temporary fixes will need to be dealt with systematically. So for example, this implication of the move to pass-fail on transferabilities to majors and to further education, and especially, are students getting good information about the consequences of this? They have a choice, but do they really understand the consequences of that choice in some cases? Or they may just have been put in a fail situation. But if this does continue into the fall, the system is not set up for the large majority of students to have pass-fail credits. So that will be something needed to be addressed more systemically. And then if you think about the degrees that require in-person or work-based studies, practicums, what will be the impact on students and on the workforce there as well. I want to move on to the next slide, which is talking about challenges for institutions. So a big concern is recruitment and admissions. We know already that they're struggling with recruitment and admissions for the 2021 academic year. I heard anecdotally that a survey is finding that a good number of students are high school graduates this year are considering a gap year for next year. There is uncertainty about what this will look like in the fall, whether the schools and campuses will reopen. And you know, the interesting question of, will the typical effects of a recession where we see large number of students going back to school, will this hold true in this unprecedented environment? And if so, will it be many more students learning online? And for the many institutions that are reliant on tuition and fee income, the uncertainty about fall enrollments and about fiscal stability is significant. And we also should consider what impact this will have on some of the smaller institutions and whether there are protections that can be put in place for those as well. Thinking about higher education, the impact on state higher education budgets. So state higher education budgets were just recovering from the 2008 recession for the most part, and they were getting back to normal and or even looking at significant expansions. We were hearing states looking to expand their funding for promise programs from 2 to 4 years, looking at expanding or creating new promise programs for adults, finding new ways to build on that idea of free college or the promise. And we do know that states that were looking to expand free college are already having to cut back. Beyond tuition and fees and state support, institutions may also see a hit to their athletic programs. They're getting less money due to some, the basketball tournaments and whatnot being canceled. So the question is, how will this affect overall higher ed budgets? And will there be additional impacts on programs or on scholarships? And will institutions have to cut sports programs? And, the implications of this continuing into the football season are fiscally important. Another challenge is that flagship institutions rely significantly on international students and their tuition dollars, and that is likely to slow or stop for the foreseeable future. And certainly the big issue of efficiency will remain a central issue for institutions. They're going to be asking for more money, which will most certainly renew questions about how they can better allocate their resources and create efficiencies. I wanted to talk a little bit about concerns about closures and how states might support financially stressed institutions and systems. So given concerns about institutional viability and the impact on students and communities when schools close unexpectedly, states may want to take steps to ensure fiscal viability and transparency. So if a college or university does close its doors, it's important to ensure sufficient timely notice to students and staff so they can make arrangements to complete their studies with as little disruption as possible, or have sufficient time to find new employment. So we were already hearing hints of this. You probably heard about Mount Ida College in Massachusetts surprising students by closing on short notice in the spring of 2018. Students, faculty, and the community were left with very little time to prepare for their campus closing, and it created great stress for the system. Massachusetts lawmakers responded in November last year. They passed House Bill 4099, which was appropriately titled An Act to Support Improved Financial Stability in Higher Education, to provide the state with information on where colleges stand financially. And it requires those institutions found to be at risk of closing to file contingency plans for students. And they're also requiring administrators to take financial literacy training. Anyway, in closing, I do want to reiterate that higher ed in a recession is more important than ever. And in particular, the need for short-term, high-quality credentials that get folks right back into jobs is going to be critical for recovery. So along with this is a consideration around the responsibility of states and institutions to provide timely, useful information about degree options and pathways that prepare students for jobs needed in their communities. A few states are currently considering legislation to make this information more transparent and readily available online. For example, Kentucky, it's a pending bill, House Bill 419, would require their Council on Post-Secondary Education to compile data every year on in-demand jobs in the state, and would require the institutions to compile data on student success and costs, and to ensure that this information is made available to prospective students. Hawaii has legislation, it's pending Senate Bill 374, that would require universities to collaborate with the Department of Ed and the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism to create an interactive web tool for students to make better informed choices about their school and career choices. And again, given the rapidly changing nature of work, it's clear that a primary strategy for economic recovery is going to be increasing those relevant, work-ready post-secondary credentials. So next slide, as of this morning, the NCSL team is tracking 25 pending COVID-related higher education bills in 11 states for the 2020 session. About a third address refunds for housing. We saw a couple of states introduce legislation around aid to institutions. And asking institutions to identify unexpected spending due to this outbreak. But overall, there's not a significant volume of legislation, with most legislatures having paused or recessed. I also wanted to point to Austin Austin's blog that he wrote last Friday. It breaks down the higher education provisions, funding states can expect, and relief for those with student loan debt. So you can also ask questions of Austin about federal education action. And with that, we'd be happy to take your questions. And thanks for your time today.
All right, thank you so much, Sunny. I'm actually gonna, well, first off, open it up for questions, so please send your questions in. I'm actually going to exercise my moderator's privilege to ask a question that I have of you, Sunny, that I've been trying to figure out. And it's that, and this might be questions that the rest of you have, is that the federal government last week released half of the Higher Education Stabilization Fund to institutions. It's all supposed to be used for emergency aid, but the federal government leaves how that emergency aid is given out to students up to the institutions. My understanding is that that money was could be available to institutions as early as earlier this week. Have you heard anything, Sunny, about institutions receiving these funds or any conversations among institutions about how they're planning to give this money out to students?
Well, we know that they are given a lot of flexibility, but have some specific provisions around the most neediest students needing those funds to be given those funds the quickest. But I have not heard of states exerting any control over the institutions that are handing out the dollars yet. So I think that's a question. I mean, I think, so Washington had that legislation that I mentioned where they need to report to this, the institutions need to report to the state on the fiscal implications of COVID. And you wonder whether the institutions, whether state legislatures may want to insert themselves here to also get reporting about how this money is going out to the students.
Have you heard any conversations amongst the institutions for how they're thinking about this, or is it just different from institutions?
I can't say I have a specific finding yet. No, sorry, Austin.
Nope, and that's why I asked, because I'm interested in this as well. And I think the federal government has said, here's the money. And I think we're in that weird waiting period where it's somewhere in the ether, but not yet available to students. And so this is just a question I think we're all going to have, and I certainly have, as to when this money is going to make it in the student hands. And I think at this point, it's in the hands of institutions. So I was just curious where they're at. I'll ask a question that's not related to federal education. States are considering significant or will be facing significant revenue declines, and oftentimes will look to higher ed institutions as a place that they can cut funding because their institutions are able to raise revenue potentially independently, oftentimes through tuition. But some might say that many colleges and universities, particularly the large university systems, have large endowments. How do endowments play into a college's financial stability during this time, and what should state legislatures know about those endowments in terms of being able to compensate for decline in revenue?
Those are fantastic questions. Well, I think we're hearing across the board, right, that endowments and foundations are very concerned about their funding and need to be careful about their cuts that they're seeing as well. So let's sort of put a pause on that and really engage in that conversation in a couple of weeks when we talk about higher ed budgets a little more deeply, and maybe I can dig in and get better input on that question.
Okay. The one question we've got in is can IHEs use CARES Act funds to cover costs related to offering dual credit courses? And the answer to this question is a tentative yes. So the department's released guidance on the emergency aid portion of the higher ed relief funds, but there's another 50% that can be used by institutions for what is yet to be clarified uses. I would presume under that they probably will be able to. I think the department is leaning towards some sort of broader uses of funds under that institutional allotment, but that is something we're still waiting on guidance for and isn't really clarified in the CARES Act legislative language.
And Austin, I might jump in here too. One thing that we know about dual or concurrent enrollment is that it's very different from state to state, if not from school district to school district, and the partnerships that they have with individual institutions. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this is all impacted. Some students pay tuition to the institution directly. Some students pay it to the school district. Sometimes there's deals cut between the institutions and the school districts. So it's very different across states and districts.
Thanks, Michelle. Question we have that just came in is, can student aid be used for entering students or for outstanding balances? And I believe this is related to the federal emergency aid. The federal emergency aid will not likely be available for entering students. This is money is supposed to, the intention of these dollars is to help students respond to, current students respond to the needs that have arisen during this crisis. So it's not necessarily intended to offset tuition going forward, but it could be used for dealing with potentially outstanding balances as it relates to current student expenses. Although some of the specifics on that, I think we'll have to see clarified as institutions disperse these funds. But there's pretty broad flexibility as to what these emergency funds can cover. So I hope that answered the question. And if we don't have any questions, we can move into a general portion of discussion. You'll still be able to ask any questions of Sunny or Michelle during this time, but we just wanted to give you sort of a discussion period to talk about and share with us what you're seeing in terms of the state of education, both P-12 and higher ed, and sharing us with your challenges and just letting us know anything that we can be aware of and ways that we might be able to assist you. So if you would like to share with your concerns with us, you're happy to type them into the chat box, but we'd also appreciate it if you'd all engage in a little bit of discussion here. So if you have something to comment towards, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself and let us know what you are thinking.
Just to further this concern about the achievement gaps, this is Jay Kahn from New Hampshire. What I've heard, if they're 6 months off of school, which many are saying is occurring in spite of our best remote learning options, that we don't have a pre-fall entry arrangement for determining levels of students' performance achievement prior to the startup of school. I think everybody's acknowledging they're going to have to be services that traditionally hadn't been offered at grade level. And but some students will just be far enough below that grade level that they're going to need additional services. So how we quantify this is a real dilemma, and how we assess it is a dilemma. So those are the issues I think we've got a little bit of lead time on, but not a lot, because these may be the resources that we need to help start up our schools.
The one thing I will mention in response is that some of the states that are moving toward statewide assessments that have 3 opportunities to assess students and get immediate feedback. And those include the states that have been participating in the assessment flexibility through a waiver through the U.S. Department of Education. Some of those systems are being structured so that there's an immediate assessment as soon as the students enter the school, enter school in the fall. There's an interim assessment halfway or, into the school year, and then there's the spring assessment. And the data flows from flows for each student. So that there's comparable data, so you can truly see where a student's at, how much growth they have made, and at each of those periods with which they have been assessed. So I think that the answer is we're going to have to start thinking differently about our assessment systems, and those states that had already jumped in and started thinking about it, in that way and have been putting a lot of effort toward creating those really innovative assessment systems and not relying on one annual statewide assessment in the spring are going to have a lot of advantages. Or even districts that can take advantage of some assessments that are out there to, assess students right at the beginning of fall and get pretty immediate feedback for the teachers. They're going to have an advantage. So I think those are going to be real discussions that are going to be happening for sure at the district level, but I would presume at the state level too.
Michelle,
Yeah.
this is Bob Baining, Indiana. I guess I would challenge NCSL to, based on those comments, is to try to pull together best practices that's happening in states across the country, because there's no question our superintendent of public instruction met with leadership and our federal legislators on Tuesday and shared with us that it's expected that there's anywhere from 50% learning loss for math and up to 30% learning loss in language arts. And unfortunately, she has no plans as to how to mitigate that, as well as the problem we have, and I'm sure many states have, in terms of equity. Online learning is great if you have, number one, you were prepared for it, which we weren't, but number two, if you have the technology and the capabilities to have access to it. But we have, even in urban districts that were not one-to-one one-to-one schools, trying to pass out packets. Parents don't want those packets in their house. Teachers don't want the papers back. It is total chaos. And we really need to have plans. I mean, we're working at a legislative level to go to the governor's office and try to get an executive order to mandate some things. But I would really welcome any best practices, especially as we get ready for fall. I think this school year is pretty much not an issue at this point, but how do we start school up in the fall, and what does that look like?
So thank you for making that request. NCSL has been in constant contact with our policy partners at National Governors Association, Council of Chief State School Officers, National Association of State Boards of Ed, ECS, and others. And we were all just talking this morning about the fact that we feel like it would be really helpful for our organizations to all pull together and try to tackle some of these issues, because it doesn't make a lot of sense for us individually be finding examples of best practices. It would make a whole lot more sense if we could find them together and maybe produce something together and have a place where we're pooling resources. So I will mention that. And then I will also mention that we had a lot of in-person meetings planned for you all through the summer and fall. And it's our intention to repurpose those smaller group meetings so that we can be digging into some of these things. And so we want to know what it is that you need to prepare yourselves for the fall, to prepare yourselves for January, so that we can be gathering those resources and getting that information to you. And this is a perfect example of a question that I think is going to be universally asked right now. What are the questions for figuring out how much learning loss there is, and what is the plan for mitigating that? I do know there's some conversations in both that I've heard from our expert, Ashley Wallace, who I think is on the phone too, that there's a lot of conversation within the after school community and the summer learning community about how they're going to transition their summer plans and their plans for the school year in with respect to this. Hopefully those providers can stick it through this and make it through and be financially stable. And if they do, how much do they need to pivot toward academic learning versus the other opportunities usually provided through those programs?
Thank you.
Well, I know we're just past the hour, but maybe if someone or anyone has any additional comments, maybe a final comment or two, we still have maybe a little bit of time for that. Okay. Well, then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Before we leave, we just want to make you aware of the resources that our team has been putting together on the education response to COVID-19. We have landing pages for resources on K through 12 education as well as higher education. We've also got our education bill tracker. And for federal responses, which are included in these sites, we also have a federal landing page on the stimulus package on the NCSL website. And of course, we are always available to you to answer any questions that you have if our public materials don't answer your questions. And then we've got many more webinars planned in our series. And I think I said we had 4, but that's just me blending a bunch of briefings together. We have completed our 3rd webinar in the series. We have a number of them going through the end of May. Our next webinar is going to be next Tuesday, which will be related to serving students with disabilities and English learners, which again is one of the biggest challenges that districts are facing right now. Another challenge we'll be discussing next Friday is the technology divide and data privacy. So next week, we're really thinking about, as best we can, how to ensure that all students have access to education and talking about distance learning and what that looks like, not only this semester, but planning for a potential new normal in the fall. So we hope that you'll be able to join us. And in the meantime, please reach out with any questions you have. We'd be happy to answer them. So with that, I'd like to thank Michelle and Sunny for presenting, and we'll see you soon.